So thank you all for being here this afternoon. For those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet, I'm Megan Doherty. I'm the new director of the Museum of the White Mountains, and I'm excited to have you here with us in person and on Zoom. As you probably know, this is the second part of our climate and justice teach-in. Oh, Amy, will you share the screen for me? Thank you. So our event today is part of a global initiative that's spearheaded by Bard College. So we are one of 300 institutions around the world in 50 countries that are having events today that are sort of solutions focused conversations about climate and justice. And so while sometimes when we have these conversations, it can feel like we are lone voices crying into the wind. I hope that, even just glancing at this map, you really get a sense that these conversations are happening everywhere, from like the far northern latitudes throughout the globe, across all time zones, that this is we're really part of a bigger conversation. And so this morning it's all been afternoon. It just feels like we've been here all day. In our first session, we talked about some of the kind of science of climate change and some of the facts that we know, as well as some adaptations and responses, both from a biological standpoint, but also thinking about adaptations and responses from a business perspective, from a public health perspective, and from a political science perspective, right? So trying to have this be this kind of multidisciplinary conversation and thinking about both, our conversation in the second session will be more about what we can do, but we've already had some great conversations about that in the first session as well, right? Individual choices we can make, ways we can make our voices be heard, we'll hear more about as well. And so we're really glad to have you back. There were, I think we counted 50 people in the room in person earlier, and at some point there were close to 50 on Zoom as well. So it's been great to have so many people engaged in this conversation. And in the sort of interest of time, I'm gonna stop talking, just have each of our panelists just sort of say their name, and let's see, we're gonna go roughly in the order of that sheet, except that, exactly. We'll just sort of work our way this way up the table, and then we'll switch panels and have all of our conversation at the end. Okay, thanks.
All right, I'm Lisa Donor. I teach in the Environmental Science and Policy program at PSU, and I'm also the chair of the Plymouth Conservation Commission.
My name is Paige Wilson. I'm the solid waste planner at the Lakes Region Planning Commission, and I also am an assistant grant administrator for the organization.
I'm Jerry Beck. I'm one of the steering committee members of the Pemi Climate Emergency Coalition.
I'm Clint King. I'm part of the fiscal plant department. I'm the campus project manager.
Paige, you want to go ahead and get us started?
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Again, my name is Paige. I work at the Lakes Region Planning Commission, which is based out of Meredith, New Hampshire. We teeter on like a nonprofit, but also like a local government kind of line of an organization. But we advise about 30 communities around Lake Winnipesaukee about sustainable planning. It ranges anywhere from transportation to watershed management, housing, and land use development. But my focus is on solid waste and recycling and helping communities improve their recycling centers to reduce waste and encourage people to recycle more as a way of reducing the amount of material that's ending up in our landfills, and thus reducing the amount of materials contributing to greenhouse gases and impacting for climate change. And I apologize, I'm kind of losing my voice, but so I provide technical assistance to solid waste operators who work at these recycling facilities in the region to try and help, again, reduce waste, but also to reduce water pollution impacts. And that's kind of the focus of the solid waste grant through the U.S. Department of Agriculture that funds my job. And through that grant, we do a lot of direct education and outreach with community members, creating new signs for transfer stations to help make it more clear for people about what to recycle, doing workshops about waste reduction and how to compost at home, at schools, camps, community gardens, and now working, I actually have accepted a job at the Department of Environmental Services. I will be moving on from the LRPC, but doing more statewide efforts with recycling and composting at a larger scale. But still at the LRPC, we do stuff with hazardous waste events. We organize a collection every year to help people get rid of the nasty materials that are in their homes, in their garages. And it's just really great to see those direct impacts of the work that we've been doing. I recently just closed out a project with some camps over in Wolfboro and Tuftonboro, where we got some funding to produce, to build like raised bed gardens and then expand some composting sites and teach kids about how to grow their food, cook their food, and then compost it, to teach about closed loop systems and how that impacts waste reduction and climate change. So that is kind of my spiel, but again, I am leaving LRPC, so just a little plug that we are looking for interns for recycling and waste management, as well as a couple other opportunities, but if anybody's interested, let me know.
All right, so I'm speaking mostly wearing my Conservation Commission hat. Although I've been deeply embedded in working with climate change for a long time. So for a while, those two roles were somewhat disjunct from each other. But as the climate crisis has come more upon us, I see a way to blend those activities. And let me take a step back a little bit and just inform you, if you don't know, what conservation commissions do. These are entities within the state of New Hampshire, but other states have similar things, where a group of volunteers gets together and they are appointed to protect, oversee, steward the natural resources in the municipality. So that means identifying what the valuable resources are, the freshwater sources, the tourism attractions, the areas of green space for recreating, but also the wilderness areas and the wildlife that live within them. So that's basically what we do. And the traditional activities of our Conservation Commission have been really, until recently, fairly static. We have treated the environment as a stable place in which we conduct our activities. We take the amount of open space that's there and we try to grow it, because that creates more places for people to be and for animals to be. But we haven't really looked at these spaces as areas that are undergoing drastic change and likely to continue to change. So I think our commission now has to start thinking forward, thinking about we're not there to preserve what's here, but to anticipate the needs of what's coming. And so we are looking at adapting to climate change, adapting the Conservation Commission mission to the needs of climate change. So we're anticipating stresses on forests. Some of these things we talked about this morning, stresses on wetlands, stresses on wildlife and on water supplies, and on the interconnectedness of the environment to allow organisms to migrate as needed and to survive as best they can in this place that we are making safer for them or available for them. So for me, the stresses include things that have been talked about already, like changes in the phenology, changes in the timing of available water, Plants, for instance, experience a great deal of stress when they are first budding out. If there happens to be a low snowpack year and the water table is low and we happen to have a drought. That happened last year. It happened the year before, and it happened the year before that. So that the vernal pools dried out very quickly. The streams, the ephemeral streams went bone dry in May. Sometimes it happens in July, and in August, but it happened last year in May and the year before that in June. So when that happens, that means all the organisms that live in the environment need to find another place to find water. And sometimes those places are on the other side of Tenny Mountain Highway. And they have to get across Tenny Mountain Highway or somehow along the stream corridors and through the culverts to find the Baker River, which in itself last year went highly stagnant in some areas where it was barely flowing. So when we think about what the Conservation Commission can do, we're now looking at ways to improve the health of what's here and the durability of the environment that's already here. Some of that may be as we anticipate deaths due to the emerald ash borer and woolly adelgid and other insects that are coming in and killing our stands. We're looking at maybe having to decrease the amount of deadwood so that we decrease the fire risk, but improve the overall health. And we're also looking at anticipating the increase in climate refugees and the number of people that are going to want to access these areas. And we want to make those spaces available for outdoor recreation and becoming part of nature as well. So we're looking at ways of making our trails more durable and our natural spaces more accepting and tolerant of high numbers of people using them. Thank you.
We're up next.
You're up next.
All right. Well, I'll start off by reading the mission statement of the Pemi Climate Emergency Coalition. It is to educate and mobilize citizens about the climate emergency, to facilitate legislation to reduce carbon pollution via a carbon fee, to support all viable means to keep fossil fuels unburned, and to transition to a renewable energy future. That's quite a mouthful, and we're just at the very local level, the Pemi area. There are similar organizations. The statewide, it's the Carbon Cashback Coalition, and then nationally, it's Citizens Climate Lobby. And I did bring some stuff, if anybody's interested, that we could hand out. I don't have a lot of it, but anyway, the cheapest, quickest way to reduce carbon pollution is to put a price on it and let efficient market forces unleash the investment and innovation needed to transition to clean energy. And for me personally, I got concerned about the climate crisis quite a few years ago. I stumbled across Citizens Climate Lobby and their goals and everything else just aligned perfectly with mine. And for me, basically, it's the scientists are telling us we're in a world of hurt. And the economists are telling us the best way to turn things around is to put a fee on carbon pollution. And there's a Wall Street Journal article that a bunch of economists put together. It includes 3,558 US economists, 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, which is all of them, 27 Nobel laureate economists, and 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. So it's a pretty strong statement that they're making about putting a fee on carbon. The Citizens Climate Lobby, they have their main thing is carbon fee and dividend. And there is a bill that's been in Congress for several sessions now called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It really is, it's what Citizens Climate Lobby is trying to get done via their carbon fee and dividend. It consists of three different parts. The first, you want to put a steadily rising fee on carbon emissions at the source. In other words, fossil fuel companies, when they take it out of the ground, they're gonna pay, and the Citizen Climate Lobby suggestion is $15 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, which includes all the other nasty greenhouse gases. And then every year would go up $10 a ton. And that way, companies, they can predict what burning fossil fuels or extracting fossil fuel, it gives them a clear path of what's going to happen, which allows them to innovate however they see fit to curb their usage of fossil fuels, which makes a ton of sense to me. The second part of it is returning all the proceeds from these fees back to American households. Let's just use gas for an example. So if we put a fee on carbon, the Exxon's going to raise their prices at the pump. It's going to cost everybody a little bit more money. But if you take all that money collected and give it back to households, most households actually come out ahead. So it enables the transition without consumers getting crushed. And the third thing is a border carbon adjustment. If we put fees in this country on carbon, but countries that we do business with don't, then Exxon's going to move their operations overseas. So this would, imports that come into this country that don't pay a fee would get charged there. So it works out for US companies exporting and for foreign companies importing. And that's the carbon fee and dividend in a nutshell. If anybody's interested in starting a CCL chapter, some universities do have their own CCL chapter. I have a contact for a woman that did just that at Bowdoin College. And if anybody's interested, see me afterwards.
It's all good. So again, I'm with Fiscal Plan. Overall, Fiscal Plan's response to climate change is attempting to lower our overall energy footprint through more efficient infrastructure building systems. I'm also in charge of utility purchasing on campus. We spend approximately $5.5 million annually on our utilities. Our primary utilities are compressed natural gas, which powers the cogen plant, which is the heating system for the campus, oil from miscellaneous small buildings in the cogen plant don't have access to CNG, then electricity. So our goal is to lower overall energy consumption, which is hard nowadays with energy prices skyrocketing through the roof, while introducing more sustainable sources and technologies. So many view natural gas and CNG as more of a bridge fuel towards more sustainable energy. And right now we're running on CNG, where before it was mainly number 2 heating oil, very dirty fuel. And right now we're coming up towards the end of a contract with our CNG provider, and we're going to work on our next phase of our RFP to try to put a requirement in there for renewable natural gas. So that'd be coming from landfill gas, essentially. So that'd be one step closer to a more sustainable future for the university, kind of closing the loop ultimately on our carbon footprint there. So we've discussed some unique opportunities for that, so we're pretty excited about that. We also utilize biomass boilers at the Allwell Center, so I'm sure anybody that's taking science class toward the facility there. We're currently undergoing a feasibility study to introduce 2 additional boilers to take care of the heating requirements at the PE Center. So we just had a meeting about that yesterday, so that's very exciting. We see approximately $20,000 a year with the thermal recs that we have a third party manage for us on this as well. And solar, we have solar on campus on top of PI and also the PE Center. We're looking at other areas to expand. We've had an engineer do a survey of different structures, determine suitability, so we're working through that. In terms of electricity, our big push right now is LED lighting. It's approximately 90% more efficient than incandescent lighting. So whenever we do projects, we're installing LED lighting, and then right now, our most recent LED project is in Prospect down in Hall there. You'll see new LED lighting next when you come back in the fall. So that's exciting. Heating infrastructure. So the cogen plant, our primary source is steam heat. It's not super efficient. We're looking to transition as we make these larger infrastructure improvements to a hot water type system. It's less maintenance, easier to control, more efficient. So I'm also working on another feasibility study for that. As anybody knows that lives in the apartments, it can be tough to heat at some point. So recently, Brian, the co-op and physical plant worked with a company in California, from Charlotte, Famata, where we purchased Nissan Leaf vehicles that have the capacity to bi-directional charge. So at Allwell, we'll be installing these chargers for these Leaf vehicles, and then on off-peak hours when they're plugged in, they'll actually feed energy back into the grid from the battery chargers. So it's a neat program. Hopefully we can expand it in the future. And then also collectively as a USNH system, we're looking to expand the car charging network on all of our campuses. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing on campus right now on the physical plant side.
Thanks, Doug. Do you want to?
Sure.
Sorry?
I said, sure, I will.
Yeah, great.
Okay, thanks. Jerry gave a great summary of the more scientific side. I'll give a little bit of an emotional side to the PCEC, Plymouth Pemi Climate Emergency Coalition. For starters, I think one of the driving forces of us doing something, and I just love this analogy, it's kind of like, we got to do something. We're not that stupid. I mean, people aren't that stupid. We are acting stupid. The analogy would be, if you're on the sidewalk at a crosswalk with your little 3-year-old kid, and the kid obviously wants to run across and you see a car coming, you don't talk to your spouse and say, well, now if Annie gets hit, are you going to call the ambulance? Or have you got the cell phone? You grab the girl and stop it. And I'm just hoping people your age are smart enough to not let us old people wreck the world. We kind of are. I got an amazing little example of it. I'm late because I'm old, and I called Jerry a half hour ago and said, geez, I'm on balloon skiing. Is that tonight or tomorrow? And he said, it's today. So I said, well, I have an appointment at Rite Aid to get my second booster. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do that. I'll be a little late. So I'm sitting there, and the guy walks up next to me, and I said, I think I recognize him. He looked ancient with a cane. And he said, oh yeah. And I knew him. I hadn't seen him for 20 years. And I said, I hope I can go next because I'm supposed to be at a climate thing up. And he said, I don't believe in that climate stuff. That's a hoax. He said, why are we worrying about something that's not going to happen for 100 years? Go figure. I mean, that is what we're dealing with. It was sad I didn't say anything. So last night, there was a webinar that any of you can get. I'm sure Jerry has the link. And it was a professor from Dartmouth who spoke. And to me, it was one of the best things I've ever heard. And we both agreed this was kind of a conservative guy. And here's the analogy. He said, what we're doing right now is if we're all given a credit card, but we only ever have to pay back 50% of what we charge on it. That's exactly what we're doing with fossil fuels. There is no, just like you have your septic system pumped, will be very cheap to take it down to the river and dump it. That's what they used to do. I used to live in Holderness not that long ago, and our bathroom emptied directly into the Pemi River. This was 1973, and there was an open pipe from the house right across the river. And that's how recent we were dumping waste into our waterways. It would be very cheap to continue doing that, but everybody now knows that that's the septic is a pollutant, so you have to pay quite a lot of money to bring it down to the sewage treatment plant. The same thing with burning fossil fuels. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's kind of like, it's not that complicated a problem. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. And I'm hoping you all that are younger will do it. Thank you.
So of course Megan walked out right at the last moment when we were transitioning, but I believe the intention was that we were going to have the second half of our panel, which is sitting over here, join in and talk, and then we were going to have a conversation at the very end. But I am more than happy to pause and have anybody that is on Zoom, if you have any direct questions that you want to pose to our panelists right now and or put them in the chat, you are welcome to either unmute yourself or throw them in the chat. Mike, if you're still on there, I would love to hear your comment. Does anybody here, since we're smaller in person, have anything direct that they wanted to comment on or question on before we transition?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I think we'll go ahead and
Do you want us to get?
Blaine, use chair, yeah. And just so that for the next group to talk, they can be visible for folks on Zoom. And then Kimberly Ritchie is on Zoom with us. I hope you guys can stay and join our conversation. Kimberly's there, and hopefully Ellie will appear at some point. Kimberly, do you want to go first? Great.
That would be great. Yeah. Am I all set?
Just give Brian a chance to sit down and then you can go ahead. All right. Take it away.
All right. Well, my name is Kimberly Ritchie. I'm a professor of art here at PSU. Thanks for letting me be a part of this. I'm going to be talking about how art can act as a platform for climate awareness and climate change. So a little bit of a different angle than what's already been discussed. I am an artist, of course, and I work in a variety of different mediums, but what has caught my interest really since my graduate studies has been about environmental issues. And the way that I've kind of gone about addressing climate issues through my art is by using scientific data. So while I'm by no means a scientist, I like to internalize the scientific data and be able to represent that in a new and different visual way to hopefully engage audiences perhaps that would not normally connect the art with the sciences. So working with scientific data and arts and sciences has been a draw of mine, and I try to bring that into my classroom through different projects that we work on as well. But I want to talk about just art and design on a larger, broader sense. And when I say arts in this particular setting, I'm meaning more than just visual arts. I'm thinking about music, documentaries, movies, poetry, literature, the arts in general, theater, dance, etc. And how can the arts act as a platform for change and a way for us to take the information that has been researched and for us to present that to the general public, to really get out information about the data where people can understand it through a different lens. So not everyone knows how to look at scientific data and understand it. So how can we do that in a different way? Also, art and design, I mean, really everything is designed. It may not be designed well, but everything is designed. And I think that going forward, if we really start to think about how we can take what we have, what we use, from very simple things to very large things like new neighborhoods being built, how can all of that be designed in a way that is going to help the environment as we move forward? I know when we talk about these topics in my classes, a lot of students feel overwhelmed by the fact of what's happening in our environment today, because they've heard it all throughout their schooling, which I think is a wonderful thing, because I just turned 40 and I don't ever remember talking about this at my high school level, about climate and what's happening. So to me, that means things are becoming more mainstream. The message is getting out, and I think that we do have the upcoming generations to help us make the changes that we need to make by bringing it more mainstream. And I think we can do that through art and design as one platform. One other thing I just wanted to mention, if Paige is still there, I wanted to mention that we're working on a community art exhibition that will be held as part of Earth Week events, also with Brian and the Office of Environmental Sustainability. And it's for community members, and the art exhibit is focusing on upcycling, so using waste and how waste can be used in different ways that could be viewed through an art and craft design lens. And I can put the link for that in the chat.
Kimberly.
We signed Heather on the judges, right? Didn't Megan on, sorry, be one of the judges?
Well, wait, no, I didn't agree to anything like that. Let's see, so Brian, you wanna go ahead and go next?
Sure, thank you. And of course, I want to begin by thanking you all for the opportunity to speak with you today, particularly the Museum of the White Mountains, Center for the Environment, and I think most importantly, the students who took the time to put this together. So really appreciate it. And when Myles, who I know well, spoke with me, he asked me to speak about individual change and climate impacts and what kinds of things someone could actually do. I think his comment was like, yeah, I've heard your spiel like this, or something of that effect. So as someone, oh, my name is Brian. I'm the Director of Sustainability at PSU, sorry. As someone who thinks about change in the broadest sense, I couldn't agree with what Kimberly shared more. And when I think about fighting climate change, sustainability, or resilience, for me, it helps to think about it as a social movement, because we're not only trying to change the way we do things, we're changing the way we think about things and how we relate to one another and to our environment. And so looking through that frame is really useful for me for trying to think about this question of what can I do to make a difference as an individual. As with all social movements of the past, well, certainly recent American history, I hope, we want to keep in mind other issues of inequality, gender, power, as we approach our climate issues. But when I think about what an individual could do, which is a question I'm asked fairly commonly, with this framework, I break it down into some different levels. You can think about it as an individual. And at an individual, many of us might immediately go to our homes, what we might do to reduce the carbon footprint of our homes. And that's one of the places where there's fun gadgets to produce sustainable, good technology, all those kinds of things. But it's important to note, of course, in the bigger picture, you can identify where our carbon footprint comes from. And so in thinking about particularly the climate impacts, we can actually use some data to guide our efforts. Homes are about 1/3 of our carbon footprint. Our transportation is about another 30%. Our food is about 15% of our carbon footprint for a typical American. And then it's things we purchase that make up the last quarter. So I don't expect anyone to remember all that detail, but you can start by recognizing we do a lot of things that have an impact, and there's no one thing that's an easy solution. But again, on an individual level, you could think about there's tons of good information out there, even actual legitimate actions that reduce your carbon footprint. Things that range from avoiding a transatlantic flight once a year, which has a really big impact, to things like doing all your washing cold water, which has a surprisingly large impact, larger than recycling, for instance, and things like that. So my intent here was Not to give you the full litany of all the individual actions you could take, obviously, but rather to point out a few of the areas where I think you can look for information if you want to and find some simple things that can make a difference. Within the home, of course, one of the things, and it even stands in its own category that I mentioned earlier, one of the things people ask about a lot is diet. And of course, diet is a significant contributor to our carbon footprints as individuals. To those who know me a long time might be shocked to learn I'm not trying to convince anyone to be vegetarian or vegan. Because as we look at it at an international level, the solutions are actually fairly straightforward. We need cultural change to do a couple of things. First off, the good news is eating well for you is eating well for the planet. A lot of the things that reduce carbon footprints in diets promote lower risk of type 2 diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and other illnesses. The most obvious thing we can do, but something we should always remember, is reducing food miles in what we eat. That is where things are coming from and the amount of energy that's put into it. And most importantly, looking at less red meat. This is the way I approach thinking at the individual level. But as we look at social movements, of course, there's work at the community level, which we heard great examples of in our first panel from both Lisa and I know some of the folks over there. And beyond that, it's also important to recognize that we need large changes in the way we do things that can be enforced by federal law, just as the Pemi Climate Emergency Group is promoting. And that's a critically important mechanism. So my takeaway for you all is that there's lots of things to do to try and help reduce carbon footprints. Never will working at just the individual, the regional, or the federal or international level achieve it. These things have to be integrated in our efforts, and I encourage you to take small steps. Helping in any way you can is the most important thing.
My name is Myles Sornborger. I'm an environmental science and policy student here in my senior year. I also have a sustainability minor and a biology minor as well. And what I wanted to talk to you about was very similar, but not quite the same, which is the way to think about making those changes for yourself. Because there are a lot of things that you don't have control over. And I think that a lot of people who get to know these issues start to feel a lot of what they call green guilt. And they feel constrained in what they want to do and what they do due to what they know the impact of those things is. And while those should be considerations, I'm going to go through a similar list that Brian just went through, but I'm going to go in the order of what makes the most difference. Which means political change comes first. If we can get systemic changes through governments and regulation, then your lifestyle may not have to change at all. It's easier. And as you move through your life, the way that you interact with communities, going from the community level all the way up to the federal level, can be different. People our age are much more likely to tweet at our representatives than we are to send a letter or to make a phone call. But also, as you move through your life, you're going to make connections with companies and other organizations. And I encourage you to look at the day-to-day operations. And when you feel things like green guilt, and instead of saying, well, I wish I could just stop eating because that would cut my carbon footprint down. Instead, try to focus that energy towards like genuinely reassessing what it is that you have agency to do. So if you've been at a company for a long time, or I mean, a couple of years at least, your input starts to matter a little bit more maybe, and you can talk about the smaller changes like putting sensors into the room so that the lights turn off when nobody's in there, or the fridge in the break room that's from 1952. You can have that replaced. And these are all like day-to-day things, and they seem relatively small, but really they add up. And if you move through your life and start to make these changes, sustainable changes at each place that you touch and each organization that you join, it really adds up to be a lot. And that's the kind of agency that I want everybody to feel like they have. Because it's a time to, it's really a way to be kind of clever and to think about what it is that you can do. Then you get down to the personal level, and you should focus on personal efficiency, I think, which means changing the things that you don't have to interact with every day. So if you can afford to have a more efficient car, or if you can get better insulation for your home, things like that, they'll cut down your carbon footprint by quite a bit, but you won't really have to like bear with personal sacrifice. And those changes also add up to be a lot. Not all of them are expensive. Even making a change like choosing to have a heated blanket rather than warming your entire house at night or something like that are the, again, the kind of ways you can try to be clever with how you're cutting down what you're doing. And then finally, we get to personal sacrifice, which I think makes a difference in a major kind of way, but you have to think about what makes the most difference and when it matters. So Brian brushed over in diet, he talked about red meat. And I think beef in particular is the bad guy here. The footprint from beef is huge compared to any plant, compared to most other meats, compared to dairy, all of that. And so if you have less red meat, if you have hamburgers less often, only at the cookouts with your family, whatever it might be, cutting that down at all is a personal sacrifice. But it makes a difference, and you can feel good about that, I hope. You can have a 6-ounce steak instead of an 8-ounce steak. And then when it comes to personal sacrifice and food in particular, I always like to think about kind of like a damage is done principle. So if somebody already bought it, I'm gonna eat it. But I think that those types of things are a good way to frame our conversation when it comes to personal action, and really focusing on where you're at in your life, where you live, what you have the ability to do within your means, should be the way that we frame it.
Great. Thanks, Myles. And we eventually will have one more student. I think it'll be maybe 3:30 before she can get here. But while so those are our sort of panelists for right now, we want to open up the floor for conversation both in person and in Zoom. Again, if you want to unmute, you should feel free to speak your question, or you can put it in the chat and we can read it out for the group. Yeah, for those of you some of you who've already spoken want to join Brian and Myles in front of the camera there.
I think it's really interesting talking about like food miles, because being a college student, everything is you're constantly making a decision of like, do I eat something that's cheap and quick, or do you take the time and go get something healthy that was made within a couple towns here, and I'm always at the constant green guilt here as a college student, as a senior, but it's always something I think about on the back burner.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I think that's an excellent point. And particularly at the individual level, a lot of what we consider sustainability actions are not equally accessible to all. People of different incomes, all kinds of differences produce barriers to what people can do. It's also part of the way we express identity in American culture is through what we purchase. And so there's even a dynamic in which you can sort of critique how much we are buying it to really make change and how much of it is to express who we are. The good news for all of that about the concern you expressed is that political change is one of the things that's accessible to all, hopefully. Not equally, as we know, we have a lot of inequality challenges, but it doesn't have the cost barriers. So I encourage you to, I try and say, I love to give advice I can't take. So, but try and ease up on the ego guilt and recognize much as Myles was saying, there are some things you can do and some things you can't. And if I also may echo another thing Myles said, a lot happens and it's really important to work at that community and higher level. So if you do that, maybe buying cheap food so you can afford some beer isn't bad.
And to follow up on your question, there's another question in the chat about tips for living more sustainably in student housing and well renting in general, right? So thinking again about these sort of life stages, phases in our lives where I might be able to make some choices as a homeowner who owns a car, but what about for folks in student housing or renting? I don't know if Clint or Brian wants to speak to the campus side of things.
I think we should hear from students, but I'll speak to it because I've heard from students for a lot of years. So I can share my 2 cents, but I definitely think they need to have the most important voice. Off campus is really a challenge for living sustainably. One of the big ones is a structural barrier about how much landlords want to get into the students being responsible for their own waste, because that's what would involve for them to be able to take recycling to the local dump. If they don't trust students to do that, that's why they have all the dumpsters, and they have one dumpster because buying a recycling dumpster costs them more. So there are some structural challenges there. I'm happy to share that this year's winner of the Panther Pitch on campus was a student who is developing an online marketplace so students can sell one another furniture at the end of the semester, and we'll store it in a local storage unit so that the buyers don't have to worry about taking it home. And anyway, that's her project, but she's doing great. We're working on with her, and hopefully that'll actually roll out this spring. Myles, I think I put you on the spot. You're the only student. Could you tell us a little bit about off-campus living and the challenges?
Well, actually, I think it was on campus was the question. And that's
why I didn't know if Clint had any insight into it was both.
Yeah, I mean, for what students have available on campus to them to control lights, largely turn your lights off when not in use, and then less hot water.
unplug electronics.
Well, unplug electronics, keep your windows closed, it can't be heated in the building too. There's a tendency of students to leave windows open when it gets hot. It's just a huge energy suck.
And then if you're on campus, you probably you may have a meal plan. So your choices there are limited. So really you can focus on what's left. And one thing that I noticed a lot of people get their stuff brand new from Amazon. They can't get it around here, or Walmart's another like easy choice. But I encourage you to explore. Thrifting around here, for whatever reason, in Plymouth specifically, is fantastic. I don't think I bought a piece of new clothing since I started coming here, because it's, there's a lot available. And then there's also a ton of other people who are going through the same transitions as you are. And so they may have things like textbooks, but also like Brian was talking about furniture. If you know the places online to look for people who are trying to get rid of stuff like that, like those miles that things has to get shipped here, there's a lot that we can recirculate, and you can do better about recirculating too. They say that like donating clothes is fantastic, but if you can find a friend who would wear those, like that article of clothing, then it's 100% chance that there's somebody who's actually going to use it, and it's not just going to get thrown away.
Okay, can you hear from the camera?
Yeah. If you can see your words showing up, the mic's picking them up.
Okay, I can give a little different perspective too on the question. My family has been an off-campus landlord in Plymouth for going on 40 years, and we currently rent to 200 students. And because the next generation, my son, is running a business, he just made a commitment with my agreement. We burn about 25,000 gallons of oil a year. It makes me a little ill, but that's what it takes to keep 200 people heated, even though we have bought an insulating machine, we bought a lift, we drilled out every building and blown in cellulose, we sprayed foam in every single basement, we put in thermal pane windows. We're still burning an awful lot of oil, so we just made the commitment to make it to 100% conversion to heat pumps. It's a big commitment. They're expensive. These buildings, actually, I was the plumber guy who put in all the thermostats so every bedroom would have individual heat. And to abandon that, to take the furnace out and basically throw it away and put in heat pumps is a major consideration. And we're doing 4 units this summer, already have it hired out. So in thinking ahead in the long run, it will have been not only obviously the right thing for the environment, but also the right thing for the pocketbook, thinking long term.
Can I also follow up comment? Like, I do feel that students oftentimes as renters off campus feel that they don't have power over that conversation, and you are the demand, right? So I know, like, in the sustainability minor years ago, we had a conversation when we were sort of auditing Plymouth's sustainability. One of the major issues was off-campus housing, and so there was discussion coming from the students about wouldn't it be awesome if we had a third-party audit about off-campus housing so that it was rated, so that students, when making a choice about where to live off campus, if they actually cared about that there was transparency, and whether that was transparency sort of arising from the individual landowner or the rental agency, or it really was third party, reviewing it, saying this place has a horrible carbon footprint, like take this into account, and thinking about that as part of the options that you have.
Yeah, there is something I think that students can do to get involved in the political end of things without a lot of effort. If you have the time and have the interest and go online and look up Citizens Climate Lobby, they have an action on their website. There's an action tab that you can pull down, and it gives you a script that you can call Jean Shaheen, Maggie Hassan, and Annie Custer. It takes 2 minutes a call. You can do it once a month. If our politicians don't hear that we're concerned about climate change, and we have to demand that these people act, and literally, it would take, if you did it once a month, it would take a whopping 6 minutes each month. And that's one thing that's easy to do. And we'll see how effective it is, because right now our representatives are not pursuing the climate crisis the way they should. And I'm double booked. I have to take off. Thank you for having me, and keep up the good work.
So there was a page where you
I just have like a little 10 seconds, just a little plug in. For stuff to do like in the home, if I know that a lot of students use the dining hall on campus, but you also go to the grocery store and purchase food for when the dining hall is not open. And just understanding how to properly store your food can save you so much money, and you're not letting your food go to waste. And I know there's a website called savethefood.com, and they have outlines of how to properly store like beans, vegetables, meats, frozen foods, like how to understand date labels. Like that's a huge part that you can educate yourself about, how to control like your food waste in your home, whether you're an on-campus student, off-campus student, community member, anything. So.
Yeah, the food waste issues.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring up a comment that anybody here can read, but also in the Zoom chat. So Brittany, I'm going to be your voice today. I'm going to speak loudly enough, so hopefully everybody can hear me. But I think you raise an excellent point, and she raises an issue about how we're working with younger generations, that oftentimes they're extremely worried about their future. They have eco-anxiety, and we see this. This is like very prevalent in our society now, and recognizing that every time grown-ups say it's on you, kid, right? Like the next generation, this is your problem to deal with. It would actually instill a lot more confidence if there were role models and mentors that are adopting the changes that are being proposed. And for me, when I read that comment, I reflected on it. That's exactly what climate justice is, right? It's the generational gap as well. It's not just the geography justice. It's not just saying that Pacific Island nations are taking the brunt of climate change now, whereas New Hampshire, New England may not be. It's the fact that the children of the future generations are. And so trying to acknowledge that, and also adopt our strategy so that we are being, you know, the 40-somethings in the crowd are actually being very strong role models for that next generation to recognize that it is our own sacrifice too. And we've lived large for quite a while, you know, like even older generations as well. And sort of acknowledging that eco-anxiety is a real thing that a lot of people don't recognize, but it's a real thing. So Brittany, thank you for posting that.
I'd like to kind of comment to that because yeah, I've been working with climate science since the 1990s, and I've gone through a lot of mental stages of accepting the idea that climate change is real, of understanding what that meant in terms of changes and transitions that were likely to happen, and then finally coming around to, well, you know, what does that mean in terms of lifestyle and expectation changes that are generational? So one of the things that I talk to my classes about is that the role models that your parents gave you were based on the role models that their parents gave them and that their parents gave them. Traditions of having families and what a home means and where you live and what you expect out of work and these kinds of things. These are no longer relevant to some degree in the future that we're looking at. And so you have to make your own decisions about what life means to you, what your future means to you, what home means to you. Being able to live in the countryside and commute to the cities for work is a privilege that we don't really have the option for in the future if we're really going to deal with climate change. Having a big family, having an expectation, for instance, of somebody my age, having an expectation of their grandchild existing or having more children. These kinds of decisions about population growth, they need to be thought about and decided upon on an individual level, right? But these are important because the reason we're facing this is there are too many people demanding too many resources in this world. But the other aspect of that is, maybe I hope more encouraging, which is that we often think, I think we can often get into a sense of despair that one individual effort, one person changing a diet isn't going to make a difference because there's a huge population of the world out there that isn't necessarily doing it. But in terms of the scope of what needs to be done, we don't all need to do everything. If every single person in the world did something, we would be in such a better place than we are now. The problem is that the vast majority of people in the world are not changing their lifestyle in any way. So the more people we can get engaged in doing something, whether it's a change in diet or making a different decision about what car you want to have, or if you need a car, or what size home you need, or if you need a home, a personal home versus a rental home. Now, these kinds of decisions are ones that we all consciously make at some point in our lives. And if everybody in the world were consciously making choices that they thought might be better, create a better future, that would make a huge difference because there's so many of us. We have the power of the population as well as impacts of the population.
Peggy, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Sure. I very much appreciated Brittany's, I guess she's losing her voice, and I had to step away, so I hope it wasn't already answered, or maybe it was. But I really appreciate her comment about students, young people feeling overwhelmed and in despair because adults aren't taking up the baton. And I also can relate to what was just being said about also being in that frame of mind of sometimes feeling absolutely overwhelmed. The next day I'm ready to go and do what can be done. I'm on the steering committee of the Sandwich Climate Group, and we just voted for the carbon cashback as a town. It was really hard work, and I appreciate that not everyone has a whole lot of time to spend, but I really also appreciate what was just said about do something. And I also think legislatively is, for me, how I feel like I have to concentrate on that, as well as personal life. But there's just so many exciting areas to go into. And it is discouraging to have to deal with people who are still in denial about climate altogether. It's hard to get going out of the garage with a direction when you're still in this box arguing with people or trying to really spend the time that's needed with them to reinforce that things are changing in a big hurry with climate for the worse. So if the students at Plymouth the students for conservation, environment, sustainability, if they could be in the younger classrooms, that would be wonderful. I know my small group is kind of maxed out, but we've been in the schools as well. Thank you.
Peggy, would you mind sharing the link to the sandwich climate group that you mentioned in the chat for everyone?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ellie's here, and I want to. So, two things. One, I want to kind of bring up this point that was made in the chat about land access and sustainable farming that Susan Skinner brought up. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else, or if there's others who wanted to think about that. I mean, I think again, when we're talking about climate and justice, this sort of access to land is a big piece of this, right? That for farmers of color, there's less access, right? The sort of systemic exclusion of people of color from the sort of loan possibilities and all of these structural things that have restricted access is a big piece of this too, and thinking about who has access to that land and who wants to be doing this work but can't, whether it's because of systemic things or because, the wealth inequality is also systemic. So just how that ways of thinking about that, finding ways to sort of match the desire to be doing this with the access. I think it's great to be thinking about that as well. So thank you for that comment. Ellie, do you want to come up and talk a little bit about your perspective as a meteorology student who helped to plan this event? You want me to come up? Yeah, and there's actually a name tag for you there if you want to. Yeah, it's on the table there. There we go. Thank you.
There's the chair. All right, so yeah, my name is Ellie. I'm a senior meteorology student here at Plymouth, and I basically am going to bring the perspective of a meteorology student and how we're kind of tasked with understanding climate change and the kind of career paths in meteorology that communicate climate change. So often when people find out I'm studying meteorology, they'll ask me if I believe in climate change, which is kind of a silly question because it makes climate change seem more like a religion rather than a scientific spectacle. So what this says to me, though, is that the general public views meteorologists as primary communicators for climate science, and that's kind of a responsibility we have to undertake kind of unwillingly because the weather and climate are not equal, but that's a discussion for another time. So there's kind of like 4 distinct career paths in meteorology. You have forecasting, research, emergency management, and broadcast. Broadcast probably be the one that most people are familiar with. So we're going to start with forecasters. So forecasters, say someone working at the Weather Service, is going to be concerned with climate change as it relates to their forecast area. So for example, someone working in the Weather Service in the Southeastern United States is going to be interested in like the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, where we had 30 named storms. Like, is that going to repeat itself, and how can we prepare for it in terms of communicating with the public and so on and so forth. And then researchers, they cover a wide spectrum of topics, but it's becoming kind of an increasing trend to interloop climate change into your research topic. So for example, I'm doing an honors passion project on atmospheric rivers in the Middle East. Now, for those of you who don't know, atmospheric rivers basically just dump a lot of rain in a really small place in a very quick period of time and to cause a lot of flooding events. So when I was reviewing papers for this project, I found a lot of them mentioning, hey, climate change is going to either increase or decrease the frequency of these events. And so understanding, you know, how climate change relates to every single topic of meteorology is becoming increasingly more important. And then, you know, branching off from like flooding events, you have emergency managers who are tasked with understanding climate change science and communicating it to like local officials, because they want to know, hey, let's think like wildfires. You want to know when there's any wildfires and like when you can get your water resources ready in advance. So that's kind of like the role emergency managers have to play in both understanding climate science and teaching people how to prepare mitigation efforts. And then broadcasters. I feel very bad for broadcasters because they kind of have to deal with the public and people on Twitter just making comments about what they have to say. But they communicate directly with the public and are often the public's #1 source for weather and climate science. And again, they often brunt the responsibility for a majority of climate communication. So typically broadcasters aren't going to get on the TV and be like, hey, the temperature is 90 degrees today in March. Very clearly climate change. That'd be very irresponsible of them to do something like that. But one thing they might do is be like, hey, you know, every December for the past 5 years, it's been increasingly getting warmer. You know, you implicitly get the idea of climate change to the audience without being super explicit. And a lot of like the openness to receiving climate communication from the audience perspective is who you're talking to. So for example, the Massachusetts market is going to be a lot more open to hearing about climate change than say Alabama, where they're going to have a bit more resentment and more kind of like antipathy towards hearing about climate change from a broadcaster. But again, it's a lot more responsibility and knowledge on the broadcaster to know what they're talking about and who they're talking to. So overall, you know, regardless of what career path a meteorologist takes, you have to communicate and understand climate change to some degree and know who you're talking to. You know, and our goal is underlyingly the same. We're communicating climate science and using our knowledge to keep the public as safe and informed as possible. It's more or less what I had to talk about.
Thanks. Thanks, Ellie. And I don't think I said at the beginning of this session that there were, you know, so Amy and I sort of reached out to Amy when I had this idea, and then we worked with 4 students, 3 of whom are in the room now. So Myles, Ellie, Autumn, and then Jack was here earlier and spoke about sort of the climate impacts of winter recreation. And so again, you know, what can students do and what are some impacts you can make? Well, you can reach out to me and plan more events, right? And really just think about what does advocacy look like on this campus, right? So we've had a whole flow of people through the Zoom, and you know, there were roughly 50 people in the room this morning, and so there's, you know, that's another way to kind of connect. Yeah.
I think just as a bit of history, it's important to know students have maybe more power than you expect. And one of the examples that I always feel great about citing is the work of students probably about 5 years ago now. They did a petition drive with students on campus in support of what was called the Climate Realities Project. And that was a pledge that universities would be 100% renewable electricity by 2030. They collected thousands of signatures. It was the largest petition drive ever at PSU. And we were the first university in the nation to sign that agreement. And there is no way the president would have made a commitment like that if the students didn't express clear voice. So that is, if you will, sort of the grandest case of it, but you can do the same things about dining hall service and all kinds of things. So obviously it's not always successful, but you'd be, I hope, surprised by what you can achieve.
So that political action can happen really close to home as well as, you know, Washington.
So there's another question from the chat that was partially sort of responded to, but I want to go back to the original question here, which was, do conservation commissions ever work on protecting agricultural land and sustainable food production? There was some chatter in the chat, if you will, from here's Larry Spencer, who's with Wilderness Conservation Commission, but I want to give Lisa the opportunity to respond to that as well about agricultural conservation, local food production.
Yeah, so protecting the local farms and the farmland itself is a really important aspect of a community. And as a conservation commission, we have looked at, you know, our various farms that are currently active and also abandoned farmlands that could potentially be renewed. It's harder to protect farmland than it is to protect forests. There are fewer funding opportunities for doing so, for instance. A lot of forest protection comes with the idea of, well, it can be continued, it can be used for public use. Whereas farmland is usually under private ownership and they're not really wanting the public to come in and use it. You just want to protect it and maintain it so that the food is always available. The other part of protecting farmland that is a hurdle, I think, is that while we want local foods and we want access to fresh foods and we want the ability for those farms to continue to thrive, we also don't want to pay $10 for an apple. And that cost of maintaining that farm isn't matched by the price of food in the grocery stores. So when we have outside vendors, Walmart, buying food from China and being able to ship a whole bag of apples that they can put on sale for $2 for the bag, those local farmers are not going to be able to compete with that. So unless, if they want to have an orchard on some of their fallow land, for instance, that's a multi-decadal investment. And, you know, they have to think really twice about whether or not they're going to be able to sell enough produce to justify the use of their land that way. Or maybe they should sell it to the developer and get that money up front for the subdivision. So this imbalance of the value of the land in its theoretical sense as a food producing space versus the value of that land and the immediate money that could come from it, that's the biggest hurdle. We don't, in the community, we don't provide an incentive, a big enough incentive for farmers to maintain their land beyond their immediate ability to get a profit from it. And that is a huge hurdle that I think as a community, we need to think about different ways of valuing that land.
I think it goes beyond that too, like, yes, all of that, and also taxes, right? So Plymouth has fairly high property taxes because we have a school system here. And so thinking about opening avenues for agriculture so that we're not pricing farmers out of land, right? And I think that can be said for like all the Lakes region, the Whites, our property values are increasing so quickly that is a major issue. So I think a lot of that is going to be tax incentives at the state and the federal level as well to support agriculture, new generation of farmers, and different approaches.
Just building off of what Lisa said, that sometimes when farmers don't have an incentive to harvest all of the produce and vegetables that they've been growing all season, there is an organization called New Hampshire Gleans, and they will recruit volunteers to come in and help farmers gather the produce and kind of do it for free. So it's not really any more of a burden on the farmers, and then bring it to local food pantries and shelters and schools as well. And then the New Hampshire Farm to School Network also tries to work on incentivizing schools to connect with local farmers to help get local healthy foods into schools for cafeteria meals and things like that. So there are some local groups that are helping to pick up some of the slack, which is nice. So.
Excuse me, I just added in response to the question that while I completely agree with Lisa and groups like the ones that she's involved with can do good work in this area, it's also a case where town zoning policies can reserve agricultural land for that use. That doesn't mean the landowner won't buy it out and build their McMansion on that property, but it's certainly part of the puzzle of protecting those things.
Plymouth zoning law right now allows something zoned as agricultural land to become Riverside Landing, right? That was zoned agricultural land. Riverside Landing is where the new McDonald's is, where the liquor store is, where the Market Basket is, where the Fairfield Inn is. That used to be a cornfield. And that used to be a solid area of soil deep soil, with good structure that buffered Tenny Mountain Highway from the river. And now it's all built, and then there's this big compensation pit. So actually the risk to Tenny Mountain Highway is greatly increased by that development. But that's the problem with the agricultural land zoning, is there's basically nothing that is prohibited on it. Why have the zone?
If, yeah, depending, I mean, no disrespect to anyone who's volunteering their time for any community, but it can be written in ways that could be more protective than that example. My response.
I'd like to ask a question of the group, online group and a group in person, which is, what do you perceive as your own individual greatest barrier to making a change or an activity in your life towards dealing with climate change, whether it's accepting it as this thing that you have to deal with, or making a personal change that you think can make a difference? What's the biggest thing inhibiting you from doing something?
I think right now, probably just lack of independence. Like I can't buy a house that is sustainable because I don't have money to live with my parents. And like I can't choose which residence hall I really live in. And like you can only really do so much as a student, and you have so much resources. So like I make small steps and I try to talk to as many people as possible. But to make like the big changes that I want to do, it's like I just can't yet. Like I'm only 20.
I want to say something encouraging to students. I've done ecological and carbon footprints with students in classes many times, and I think, well, a couple of you can attest to this. You will never have as small a carbon footprint as you do as a college student. You are not, you know, most of you live either on campus or driving, you're eating out of a dining hall, you walk to classes. I mean, seriously, it's amazing. But so if there's ever a time in your life where you shouldn't feel guilt, it's while you're at that university.
You're also saying you're sharing a household with your family, which is completely understandable for people of our generation. But that's a household with one person, and you're not like adding another house, which is difficult from a social standpoint. I totally understand that. But. Go ahead.
I would say like one of my biggest stresses is like my car sometimes, it's just like cost, gas, maintenance, stuff like that. But financially, like I like an electric car, but obviously we don't have the means to have $20,000 a month or something yet. So I don't know.
My car is one of my bigger stressors also. Yeah, because I have long felt that I can't really afford those more economic cars. I buy what I can afford and then I use it. But it's not the best car. I would love to be able to be in a position where those fuel efficient cars are more affordable. And I know students deal, you know, you buy the clunkers because they're cheap, and they're often the ones that are very inefficient, and you're constantly repairing them and putting oil in them and putting gas into them, but it's what you can afford.
I'm going to tell you not to worry about it again because of what I call embodied energy. It is true that the vehicles, cheaper vehicles, are having a heavier carbon footprint. But compared to the carbon footprint of buying another car, replacing that vehicle, shipping the used vehicles, actually most often go overseas nowadays, either Africa or South America. Even though it seems a heavy footprint, if you were to measure the overall carbon impact, what Lisa said, drive it forever, is probably the best way to reduce it once you have the car. Next time you buy, worry about it then. But replacement, honestly, that's a good place to think about whether it's, we all kind of enjoy new cars, that's one of the products of American culture, but it's, if you were to really calculate it out, we're better off holding manual pieces.
I'll say I'd say my biggest issue with this is not making time to take the initiative myself with certain issues, which is we're talking about calling your local representatives. I have those resources and I know where to get them most of the time. It's just taking the time out of your schedule to do it. and I feel like other people also struggle with that, is just like, you don't even have to plan it, but just make the time to actually do it. I know the resources there, just have to take it, yes.
How many of you have written it, representative? How many of you do it every year? Okay, probably need to do it more than once. I know I should probably be doing it every week. I could probably create a little macro on my computer saying, send this message out. I don't, because partly I personally, emotionally feel it doesn't make that much difference. It's my own sense of helplessness that I have to fight against to take these actions. So for me, that's that mental challenge, getting my head in a place where I feel like it does matter. And these kinds of events really help encourage me to feel it matters. But when you're on your own and you're thinking about, oh, should I do it? I was like, no, I'm gonna go do this other thing instead. And don't beat yourself up over it. There will be a time in your life when you are more motivated, and if you can take advantage of that, great. Rest of the time, being conscious and being aware is one of the biggest things you could do, I think.
Well, I'll throw out there, I think you hit part of the dynamic of climate change in a really important way. It gets back to how we assess risk and how we think of our priorities. And bottom line, with climate change being indefinite and in the future, it falls off many of our short action lists. And that's not a fault of an individual. We need to recognize that and do better. But I would argue that's a systemic problem with dealing with climate change. You can argue that's maybe why people don't legislate about it too.
I also add to that, like, just the social aspect that we all share as a community. It's been brought up today before, but just like we're driven by social cues and changes that everyone's part of. So if we have something that has been set in stone for generations, the likelihood that we're going to break out of that it's hard. Getting there. I guess for me, I don't know if I'm allowed to like talk on this, but for me, it's always been the scale of the issue. It's like, why I'm one person, you know what I mean? And then, you have billions of people on this planet, and then you have, industry, and there's like, I feel like the action I do will always be outweighed by what's going on, and like, why bother at that point? So it's kind of hard to, it's reason really doing much of anything if it's not good. If it really isn't going to make that much of a difference, just like one single person, if that makes sense.
I will say that I felt that way leaving Plymouth as a graduate master's student, but I used my career to kind of help me get involved with like local projects and local groups and getting really creative with the stuff that I was doing. And I will tell you, I feel more satisfied with my impact, like leaving work every day, whether it was just sending out emails and helping people connect, or like actually being out in the field and like doing stuff like hands-on with people who are just so grateful. They're like, thank you for helping us, and thank you for the time that you're investing in this. And you find like-minded people out in the community when you really help to start like developing it into your career. And it has helped me personally feel better about my individual impact, because it's happening on a local level. Like, it's not just me, it's like my community. And even though it might be, sometimes I do leave and I'm like, this is going to be offset by bigger things in the world. But it's like, I saw the great thing that came out of what we did today. And it was, it's great. And it's like, this is the same thing, like just being a part of this conversation and just talking to everybody, it's been very fulfilling. And I think just trying to find those moments of gratitude and fulfillment and just like the little things is going to help a lot. So it's just from my experience.
Thanks. I feel like that's like I feel like we should just wrap up there. Like, we're getting close to time. That's like exactly the kind of sentiment that we really wanted to capture today. And especially, some of you here, a number of you that I know are seniors, thinking about like, that this is this moment of transition, right? From being like a student where you're supposed to be like absorbing all this information, and now you're supposed to go out into the world and do something. And what I hope is that we, that we're all, that we're all here, right? We have lots of resources, but also that you can think about Paige as your example and take that interest and take that passion, and whether it's, working in like this very concrete way of connecting to sustainability efforts, or things like Myles is talking about. I've been sitting here for the last hour thinking about, why is there not a sensor in this room? And why have I only thought about it today? So, these changes you can make, and like, why is this fan coil been running this all day? Like, what is happening? So too bad Clint is left, because he's gonna get another email, right? So there are things we can do, even if, it doesn't seem like the title of your job is about sustainability, right? There's nothing in Director of Museum of the White Mountains that says you should be like a climate justice advocate, but you can be that in everything that you're doing. And to kind of help everyone sort of pull together some of the things we've been doing, we're gonna, for those of you that registered for the Zoom, we'll send out a list, and we know some of you have been here connected to classes, and we'll put together some of the resources that have been in the chat, some of the resources that have been mentioned, and some of the resources that some of our presenters have shared, and we'll send that out to the group, and then please feel free to share that again, right? So that all our actions have these ripples, right? Our positive actions do as much as any others. So I hope you'll take some hope away with you today, and some ideas of things you can do, big and little, to help move us in the right direction. And thank you all for coming, and especially thank you to Myles and Ellie and Autumn and Jack and Amy for helping pull this off, and for Brian and OES for kind of helping spread the word. So we're super grateful for everyone who came out today, and look forward to next year and lots more conversations in between. So thank you all.